From drones in the skies to targeted missile launches on the ground, the war in Ukraine is heavily dependent on technology.
The rise of drones and autonomous systems and the electronic warfare systems that combat them, the battle for the airwaves is just as fierce as the battle on the ground. As a result, position, navigation, and timing systems like GPS are all but unusable on the front lines of modern conflict. That's why the Space Force just created a new program to create a fully redundant GPS constellation.
So you've heard us talk a lot about GPS today. There's a lot of lessons to learn from the history of it, but we're at a really important inflection point right now where the systems that we have in orbit are critical infrastructure, but also face some risk. And so we have a great panel here to be able to help us understand where we're at today, the challenges that we face, the tremendous market opportunity, and then the technology that's being built to help us go to a whole new sort of frontier of positioning technology. So that's really what we're going to dive into today. So GPS and global navigation satellite systems, they underpin trillions of dollars of economic activity. Hopefully we've made that case very clear today so far. GPS alone is responsible for about $1.4 trillion in economic activity since the 1980s. It intersects with finance, logistics, agriculture, as we've highlighted. But these space-based systems really are becoming increasingly vulnerable to jamming, to spoofing, from warfare-related interference that's impacting areas in Europe and the Middle East, to criminals using cheap jammers to steal cargo and evade tracking. Geopolitical risks are also mounting. China's BeiDou 3 system achieved full global coverage of 45 low Earth orbit satellites back in 2020. And they have a planned constellation in 2027 that will bring significantly greater capabilities online. BeiDou is already considered to be superior to GPS in several key areas. And so, there's a risk that China could far surpass the United States in this technological area. Ensuring secure, reliable PNT in contested environments has become a national priority. And the ability to build resilient GPS and explore alternative PNT solutions is really critical. So what's needed is a multi-tiered strategy that includes satellites, ground segments, and the end user equipment, all aimed at providing redundancy and security for military and critical infrastructure. So for investors, this shift is really a timely opportunity. As defense and infrastructure budgets have surged, there's a number of private companies that are stepping in to help address these vulnerabilities and drive innovation going forward. So, from small sat navigation networks to advanced navigation systems to inertial systems, there is a push for GPS resilience, alternatives that could translate into a step change in technology that unlocks significant growth in PNT and a really enhanced capability. So that's what we're going to drive into today with that context. So Tom, I'd like to start with you first. Working at In-Q-Tel, you see a tremendous amount of important technology. Given the growing vulnerabilities with GPS and China's aggressive deployment of new PNT satellites, how urgent is the need for the United States?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to Chad, Justice, and the Space Capital team for having me. We have a lot of mutual portfolio companies with you guys, and it's a great bunch, and you guys do a good job of finding them early and sort of feeding them to us, so I appreciate that, and thanks for the opportunity. I was at an event last week that was, there were a number of government partners there with me, and it was interesting. I had a bunch of conversations related to this, and it was really the question of how urgent is this? And a lot of them were like, are you kidding? It's incredibly urgent. It's sort of, the question answers itself. What we're seeing in Ukraine and what we're seeing just in the development of China's capabilities, just across the board, it's very urgent, both on the alternative side and on the resilience side. There is some funding going into that now, but it's probably not enough. And it's a little bit, sort of too late to some degree, so we got to play catch up here. So very urgent. What I heard was that it's something that people have been looking at in the government for a long time, but maybe haven't moved out on as much as they would have liked to. It is happening now. Another interesting piece too is that what I've heard is as you look at kind of our capabilities through the years, multiple people brought up the fact that there are people in the government that have been there for a long time attacking this, but they're kind of aging out, and the workforce itself is an issue too in terms of capabilities from a PNT standpoint.
What's the risk if we don't prioritize this sufficiently?
I think there are multiple risks. One is just capability in the warfighting domain. How well can we do that? Another thing I think, Sean, you might touch on at some point is just as you look at China as an adversary, their reach with their own system and the adoption of that by people throughout the globe, puts us behind the curve just in terms of alliances and our reach across the globe.
Okay. So Brian, I want to shift to you. So Brian is CEO of a company called Xona. They're building, well, I'll actually let you describe that. So help us understand, what Xona is working on and the immediate benefit that your capabilities provide relative to where GPS is today.
Sure. So what we're building at Xona is kind of like a Starlink of GPS. So it's a bunch of small satellites in low Earth orbit, much closer to Earth, designed and dedicated to providing very high performance satellite navigation capabilities. And I guess where we came out of, so I was a SpaceX guy, but our CTO worked at Ford in their autonomous vehicle group. And a lot of what he was responsible for there was how do you provide these vehicles with the very reliable centimeter accuracy they need for you to be able to trust taking your hands off the wheel and making sure the thing is still centered in its lane. And how do you do that anywhere on the planet and in any environment, even if the car is covered in snow or dirt or mosquitoes or anything else, this still happens and can mess with cameras and LiDAR systems. And what we were finding, or what Tyler really found, is that in order to do that, you need a service that, say, matches pretty well with what Skywatch mentioned, actually, something that is available, affordable, and standardized. And to do that, though, what is really missing is you need that delivery system. And what we found is that if you're going to make something that can reach all of these things, you can't require new hardware to be added. That as soon as you require new hardware to be added to the device, that the affordability side certainly starts to disappear. So we designed our entire system around the idea that you could actually firmware or software update a GPS receiver to be able to drive really high performance into it. And so we're pretty proud of what we've been able to accomplish there. And what we found was that if you can actually provide that level of capability into, there's something like 7 billion GPS chips on the planet today. There's soon going to be more GPS devices than people, that we would solve a problem not just with the automotive world, but with mobile phones, with IoT devices, with agriculture, with all sorts of things that we never even thought of, including a lot within the government side of things.
Okay. So higher power, backward compatible, more capable.
Yeah, but precision, power, and protection are kind of we try and narrow it down to those three areas that, if you look at the challenges facing, I guess, commercial customers today, there's kind of two areas that we fill. One is that commercial customers are generally looking for a combination of higher precision and higher availability, that they want to know where they are with higher degrees of accuracy than ever before, and they want that available in places that they've never operated before. On the government side, it's, I think Rob mentioned that he doesn't worry too much about GPS satellites falling out of the sky necessarily. There's a lot of people within the government that is their number one concern. And in general, the commercial world, that what we've seen is they're not too concerned about, it's kind of a World War III or aliens are invading or something's going pretty wrong if satellites are falling out of the sky. But a lot of people in the government are very concerned about that and looking for how do you take the target off of GPS? And the best way to take the target off is to just have resilient alternatives that, first of all, can continue to operate if it doesn't exist, or that you can replenish very quickly. The other side is jamming. And as you mentioned in Ukraine, what you're seeing happen already, one of the biggest, I guess, events that caused GPS to be, when they took selective availability off and they made it available to the public, was because a 747 wandered into Russian airspace back in the 80s and got shot down and killed everybody on board. That happened again recently, that the Azerbaijan flight that got shot down and killed everybody was because it was GPS jamming. And so it's starting to already happen again. Like there's a critical need for better GPS capabilities. And that's one that kind of spans government commercial side. And it's kind of flown under the radar, but getting more and more concerning what these wide area jamming things that are happening in Israel and Ukraine are causing. So.
The risks are very real and showing up.
Yeah.
Sean, so there are many alternative approaches to GPS. You know, we have terrestrial-based systems, radio, and visual positioning that you've worked on. Can you help us understand what Zephyr's building and the capabilities it would unlock for the U.S. government?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, you know, similar to Brian, making the satellites more resilient, we think a lot about making the receivers more resilient. And specifically kind of going to those, 7 billion receivers. Most of those receivers are low-end commodity chips. And how do we enable that massive network of devices to be more resilient to disturbance? So that's one of the dirty secrets to AltPNT is that in order for the vast majority of AltPNT systems to work is it needs an initial known coordinate. And then it's managing the error once you lose GPS after having that initial known coordinate, but you still need a starting point, right? And there aren't many things out there other than GPS that can give you a highly precise last known or initial known coordinate. And so a lot of what we do is applying techniques to those devices to make the reception of that signal more resilient to disturbance. And so the approach that we take, I guess we'll throw AI in before 15 minutes, is trying to use AI to help facilitate that. So one of the big challenges of using AI with a GNSS system is that the single phone you have in your pocket now can only see so many satellites, maybe 20, 30, up to 40 possibly. But especially in a place like New York where all these buildings are occluding it and functionally jamming that signal, there's only so many satellites that you can see. And so what we do is that in the academic literature, it's a technique they call cooperative positioning, where we start getting measurements from multiple devices. And so while our devices right now may be occluded by these buildings heavily, there's a whole bunch of people in Central Park that are getting great line of sight to their satellites and getting really good measurements. And so with any kind of AI system, it needs a lot of data. And if you can get measurements from lots of devices, you can begin to understand which device or which signals are bouncing off buildings for the multipath that Rob talked about and can be ejected. And then what are ones that are giving you true measurements that you want to use for your actual solution. And the same thing happens when they're being jammed as well. You can kind of help eject it. And so that's where we started, actually just looking at the commercial side of this and taking some of those techniques from the high-end receivers that Rob was talking about, where you model the atmosphere and you model the multipath, getting measurements from lots of devices and using that to generate error corrections, but doing that for the phones in your pocket that have a $10 receiver in it instead of a hundreds of or thousands of dollars receiver. And kind of in the process of doing this, which kind of got us into the AltPNT side, as a group from Ukraine reached out and said, hey, we see that y'all are making the positioning more resilient to disturbances. We were wondering if that might help with the Russian jamming. We had no clue whether it would or not, but we were really interested in seeing if we could help out. So we sent over multiple phones. We picked up in an Odessa market. They loaded the software on it and distributed them out along the front lines of Ukraine. And we did find that it made it more resilient to Russian jamming. But the other cool thing that we discovered in the process of doing that is, since you have this distributed network of devices that is picking up measurements from all along that front line. And as it picked up those measurements, it could figure out where the jammers were and where the area that was being jammed. And so as we worked with the Ukrainians and iterated on it, one of the big problems they had with the AltPNT systems was they'd come up with a new AltPNT workaround, and then 2 or 3 months later, the Russians would have a counter to it. And then they'd have to go back again. And so it was a bit of like Occam's razor of, well, if we can figure out where the jammers are and remove the jamming, or figure out what the jamming is and navigate around it, then that gives us some additional resiliency. And then we increasingly have been integrating that into some of those AltPNT systems so that your last known coordinate, 1, is as precise as possible, but 2, it's important to know when that coordinate is starting to fail, right? Because as it gets jammed, it starts to stray off. Just like when you're trying to come here in the morning, if you're using Google Maps like I was, your little blue dot, because of all the natural jamming that comes from the building, your blue dot isn't where it should be. It oftentimes is a block off, right? And so understanding that, if you're starting to kick in your AltPNT system when you're a half a block off, and then you're using that to navigate, it can cause a world of trouble. So that there's this really tight interplay between the GNSS systems and the AltPNT systems that, a lot of the marketing is, oh, get rid of your satellites, we'll do it all without you. But the reality is these things are really tightly intertwined and intercoupled, and so we try to understand that relationship.
I think probably the AltPNT system that most people would have interacted with or are familiar with would be visual positioning. Can you talk a little bit about how your approach differs from the visual positioning systems?
Yeah, actually, the way we kind of stumbled into our approach was from working on visual positioning systems. We had a small startup that Snapchat acquired, and we were doing city-scale VPS. And the way the visual positioning system works, at least for companies like Snapchat and Apple and Google, is that you're in a place like New York and you have a database of features that Google or Snap has already created, and they've taken street view imagery, or in case we crowdsource the images off people's phones and create a 3D feature database. And so on there's pixels that are kind of anchors. And then when you open up your camera and you scan that, it finds one of those anchors and matches it to your camera and triangulates it to figure out where you are. And so that works wonderfully in these dense urban scenarios. But one of the big problems is, you can imagine a feature database for New York is incredibly big, right? And so you have to figure out where to search in that database. Where to search in that database is you use GPS to constrain your search and find the queries so you have low latency to position where you are. So even in these kind of systems, there's a really tight coupling. I mean, obviously you get into something like what Maxar is building with Raptor, you take a different approach to do much larger geographies and you do less dense, and there's lots of statistical tricks you can do to improve that, but you still have that same kind of core reliance of handing off between the systems. We kind of think of them as snow globes of, there's going to be an area that's GPS jammed, and that's the snow globe. And when you enter that snow globe, you want to be able to roll over to your AltPNT system and have that help navigate until you get out of the snow globe, and then you can reacquire and then fix that drift that you accumulated going through the snow globe. And so again, these things are so tightly coupled. I think a lot of times in the marketing and the buzz, we kind of look at these things as, oh, it's GPS or not GPS, and we don't need it. But the reality we find is that they're really tightly coupled together and interdependent.
I think that tightly coupled nature between what Brian's building at the infrastructure layer and what you're building more at the sort of end user level is important. What we're starting to see is a need for a multi-layered approach. So Brian, I know recently you were out in DC speaking with members of Congress, and it seems like there's a growing understanding that an alternative to GPS is essential, it's needed, and it needs to be a multi-layered approach. And so how should public-private sort of partners and actors collaborate to build a modern architecture?
Yeah, that's definitely a growing need from everywhere. We don't have to explain the challenges to many people at this point, that they understand it pretty quickly. I think that the satellite navigation world feels like it's in a spot that's very similar to where the launch world was about 20 years ago. And there's a very clear government need for better capabilities. And then there's a rapidly growing commercial need with emerging technologies, with rise of autonomy and IoT and all these other devices. And it's very similar if you looked at the launch world where it was back in the early 2000s. It was, okay, the shuttle had just ended. We desperately are becoming more reliant on potentially adversarial nations to get to space. And there's this kind of growing commercial market. And at that point, the government tried something new and said, okay, instead of building our own, what if we start to rely on launch as a service? And what if we embrace that and start to actually, try and support these companies that are, I think, as Johnny mentioned, back in the time, we're a little bit of this SpaceX company that's kind of a joke still. And could we actually do something with that? And a lot of those early contracts and the government embracing the idea of launch as a service is some of the things that really catalyzed the success of companies like SpaceX. And now 20 years later, if you look around the world, it is very obvious that the U.S. is the leader in the navigation world, and a lot of that traces back to the successes that they've had there. I think navigation's in the very similar position where if the government really embraces the idea of navigation as a service, which has just never been available before, there's a lot of success to be had there. And I genuinely believe that there will be a SpaceX of the navigation world that's coming out in the next 5 years. That's either going to be a US company, or it's going to be a Chinese company, or it's going to be a European company. And a lot of what's going to dictate who wins the race that we're in right now is which government can really embrace and leverage the power of their commercial markets and just their innovation in the commercial world to drive that forward. So.
I think that's a good transition to you, Tom. So, given your experience working with government initiatives and sort of mission critical priorities, what does the U.S. need to get right, to be the leader in PNT in the next 20 years?
Yeah, I think Brian's. I think launch as an analog is actually a good one. So I think the more we can leverage the commercial sector to get where we need to go, I think the better. You ask about the government partners in general. You see a mixed bag in terms of how willing they are to embrace commercial, sort of across the board in the space sector, but including here. And I think as that kind of culturally changes and they get more used to the idea that commercial can solve their challenges and do, if not everything they need, at least a decent chunk of it, we're going to be in a better spot. So I think as that happens, we'll see some pretty interesting companies crop up and serve those needs. But I do think there's a cultural shift that has to continue to happen on the government side.
Okay. Brian and Sean, this one's probably both for the both of you. How have you seen government's willingness to pay? I mean, GPS, build versus buy, it is part of that cultural shift. And so how have you seen sort of the willingness to, pay for these services, to address these critical needs?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So everybody thinks GPS is free. Yeah. Which is something that we've had to explain to investors, even to our customers. Like, well, I don't pay for GPS. Like, okay, well, did you get the chipset for free? Like, well, no. Like, okay, well, would you pay? If you take what we're doing, you abstract away satellites and ignore all of that. A lot of our sales pitch even to customers is, okay, if we could give you a magical piece of firmware, like ask how it works. Just if we could give you a magical piece of firmware that would make your GPS device operate at 100 times better accuracy, and you start to get the capability in jammed environments and indoors. Would you want to pay for that piece of firmware? I'm like, well, obviously, yes. Like, okay, well, then we're done. That we've solved it. And the difference is that the GPS market has historically been one where a lot of the value has been captured by just the user equipment sales. And so there is a massive market for GPS equipment. I mean, for a lot of what even companies like Trimble does. You're seeing it shift in some areas, for the very high performance, where they're already moving into kind of service-based pay performance with things like correction services and whatnot. So it's a mixed bag on markets, but more of them lean towards, I'm used to buying GPS as I pay for it once and then it works for the lifetime of the device. And so we've structured our services to have kind of optionality to match more of the classic models, as well as moving towards, I think in the future, things are really moving more towards a service model. Which might be good to pass it over. I think, Sean, that's probably where you operate more. So.
Yeah, definitely very similar, and that's certainly a challenge we see, that both on the government and the commercial sides, the acquisition chains are very much hardware focused. But I think as Brian pointed out, the future we feel very much is software delivered capabilities into these chipsets, to the point that there's 7 billion out there already. And if we cycle it back to the microcosm that is the U.S. government, we've had M-code on the GPS Block 3 satellites for quite a while, right? But it requires a specialized piece of hardware deployed to Department of Defense to be able to take advantage of those new spoof-proof, jam-proof signals. And there's a critical lack of those receivers out there. And this is like a topic within congressional testimony and debate quite frequently of what is preventing that lack of proliferation for these new hardware receivers. And I think that's really a testament to why there's so much benefit in going to a software delivered model. If you could just inject firmware or just inject SDK into an existing receiver and have it adopt and run M-code, the problem would be solved very, very rapidly. But when you have to do a whole acquisition and deployment to replace an existing GPS receiver within the Department of Defense and get them to adopt a new GPS receiver with these new capabilities within it, all of a sudden it goes from being something that you could probably do in an acquisition cycle in a year to something that spanned, maybe it's getting close to a decade now of trying to get these technology to boots on the ground. So I think it is really critical that we make this shift. And having technologies and companies like Xona that are pushing it. But at the same time, we need to see evolvement, especially on the government side, so that the acquisitions and appropriations match that shift and incentivize it. Because if there's not revenue to be gained from it, it's going to be really hard for companies to succeed. And then you get stuck in the same repeated pattern that's made us struggle both from a nation state as well as a private market standpoint.
Yeah. So there is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity right now that's taking shape, being driven by government defense-related needs to create this resiliency in GPS and AltPNT. There's a cultural transition that needs to take place, and we're sort of working through that, but that's an immediate opportunity. The story of commercial GPS and sort of where we're going is bigger than that, though. And so I have a chart that I want to pull up, and this chart is really a function of a conversation with you, Brian. And so if you want to just sort of frame this for us, it's really a theory of
Sure.
Yeah, a long history of technology development.
Yeah, so we've been calling this Reed's Law because this came partly out of our CTO, Dr. Tyler Reed's work. And it's kind of following like a Moore's Law of navigation to an extent. And if you go across the years, a lot of this, we have another version internally that you actually start to put different modes of transportation across it. And you chart out, and if you look at back in the celestial navigation days, you're traveling by ship. And at that point, people are probably on the ship, okay, I got to know where I am within kilometers or so. Like, this is great. Why would I ever need to know where I am within hundreds of meters or meters? And then as you get into the long wave radio and the radio navigation, you're starting to move into aerial. And again, it's okay, if I know where I am to within 100 meters, why would I ever need to know where I am to better accuracy than that? And then you start to move into, GPS, the original paper from aerospace was in 1966 and was built around basically how do you guide nuclear missiles and how do you guide planes? And again, at that point, okay, we need to get to within single digit meters. Those things make a pretty big hole. Like, why would we need to get any better accuracy? Like, why would we need centimeter accuracy to put a, crater in the ground? And so, but again, keep going forward, and you get into the, the automotive days. Okay, if GPS can tell me what road I'm on, why would I ever need better accuracy than what road I'm on? And sure enough, advanced to where we are now. Now it's okay. Well, take your hands off the wheel. The car's got to know not just what lane it's in, but if it's in the center of the lane. And so there are these just continuous technology advancements, and people today, you'd probably wonder, like, well, okay, why would I ever need millimeters? And like, we already have customers asking us for millimeters, and then going to like sub-centimeter. And if you look at, for like one example that I was stuck with me in talking to a construction customer is like, okay, I'm paving 100 miles of 4-lane highway, and the tolerance on how thick I can put that blacktop down is 3 inches plus or minus a couple centimeters. And so if I can knock off 1 centimeter times 4 lanes times 100 miles, it's saving millions of dollars of blacktop. And so they're just simple things that, the same way that GPS wasn't designed to tell a taxi where it's at, but without it, Uber doesn't exist, Lyft doesn't exist, DoorDash, like none of these things exist, that when you start to make these high performance capabilities available into the world, you see companies like Trimble and all the app developers and everyone else taking advantage of them. And we're already starting to see new and different capabilities, and companies come to us with ideas like, we never thought of that, which it's pretty exciting to see like what the next generation of having just highly available, high accuracy is going to unlock in the world.
So each technological step, as you improve accuracy, you're unlocking a new capability in terms of what you can build on top of it.
Yeah, even in the world of AI and what we've heard a lot of people mentioning, AI models are only ever going to be as good as the data that you feed them. And all data sets at this point are location tagged. And so what level of insights and what better insights can you start to make when those data sets are going from meters of accuracy down to centimeters of accuracy? And so some of our customers in like the IoT world, they're simple things like, okay, we have trackers on rail cars, and right now with GPS, we can't tell if it's on the rail car going into the building or the rail car coming out of the building, and one of those rail cars is full and one of them's empty. And so we don't know where our things are at, or even if this thing's full or empty. And so there's just more and more interesting things, even mapping. Like you can start to make a map of the world down to centimeter accuracy if you start to collect data and things like what Sean's doing. So it's just continually more exciting and interesting things to learn about as customers come to us with new, hey, can you help us with this type things?
Yeah. I'd love to double click on that with you, Sean. So how could centimeter level accuracy really improve AI's understanding of the physical world? What changes there?
Yeah, so I think on that side, the gap to bridge, or at least the gap that we're trying to bridge, if you look at this graph, right, you have mobile GNSS sitting right above, between 10 meters and 1 meter, maybe like 3 to 5 meters is kind of where it sits. But increasingly, as we look at these new modalities that we're shifting into, whether it's smart glasses, IoT devices, that we want to start moving up that curve into the centimeter level accuracy. But the challenge, as we talked about previously, is you have these $10 chips in your phone surrounded by a whole bunch of other electronics. Getting it down to that level of accuracy is really challenging. And this was really driven home for us when we were working at Snapchat, because it was, again, city scale augmented reality, and they had the Snapchat spectacles, which started off as a consumer product and now have become kind of an R&D product available to developers. And the reason for that shift is when they went to run the visual positioning on the glasses, and you're running the camera on those glasses, it's incredibly battery intensive. And as you can imagine, something strapped to your face, you don't want a massive battery on there. And so it has about a 20-minute lifespan, and then it's done, right? And so you can't really sell that. Nobody's going to wear glasses for 20 minutes and then recharge them. And so as we were looking at that, and we realized, well, we've been building VPS, but there is this inherent flaw, right? That you need an open camera running all the time that sucks up a lot of power, and it's also a little bit creepy. And so we said, well, what if we could just do it with GPS or in GNSS? What if we could get down to centimeter level accuracy with the GPS, and we could get really good orientation through sensor fusion, and we could use this collaborative positioning to sync everything together, then we wouldn't need the camera to do the pixel matching. So then we wouldn't have to map the world in 3D. We wouldn't have this battery hog. We could just focus on that. And as we looked at that, that really meant that we needed to break that gap, because you can't put a $1,000 receiver into a pair of smart glasses or a phone, but they just make it incredibly too expensive, right? They don't want to go from $10 to $15 for the chip. So it really became about, how can we take the corrections technology that's used from folks like Trimble and the high capacity of what's coming from Xona, and bake that into a commodity chip. And so we ended up doing a lot of work integrating that into, there's this 5G protocol called 3GPP that's run over the telecom network. And so you already have this great system that does assisted GPS. And so we started to look at if we could bring those cooperative positioning sensor measurements from those devices through the network. And so we worked with Ericsson to get it running on their test bed. And so now we're actually broadcasting the corrections with the ionosphere and the different measurements, and generating error corrections from this AI ensemble solver, and then sending it across the 5G network to the end user device, whether that's smart glasses or phone. And then you can start to get that kind of 50 centimeter accuracy, at least in open sky. It's obviously more challenging in a place like this. And that really begins to drive that ability to localize just using the sensors. And when you can localize just using the sensors, then that opens up all sorts of different capabilities of going with a lightweight form factor like the glasses, or going with really, with a phone, or putting cameras in the earbuds to replicate what you would do with glasses. And so all these form factors become much more reasonable, and then you can start tying them into AI assistants that are in your ear as well. And this opens up a whole bunch of really interesting use cases across the board. So I think it's a really exciting inflection point, right? You have great investments on the space side, into the infrastructure, into the corrections networks, and into the receivers and the software that we use to power them. I think it's, there's a really cool inflection point that will continue to take advantage of that as we all catch up to the shift in Brian's Reed's Law, right?
Yeah. Tom, are you seeing any, so with this technology improving, from the intelligence community, are you seeing needs emerging from a higher level of positioning awareness, whether it be through corrective services or GPS?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, in general. It's kind of across the board in a bunch of our different government customers. Sean and I were actually just talking. We did a demo day not too long ago. It was Alternative PNT technologies, and it was really well attended from a bunch of different agencies. So we're getting a lot of requests and problem sets that we field to go look for these things and look for them on the commercial side, and at least expose them to what's out there. So again, going back to the cultural comment, I think it's it's gradually, there's more interest. There's recognition that it's a problem, and that this might be a solution. The commercial sector might be a solution for them.
Okay.
So we're seeing a lot more of that in general.
Okay. Brian, you recently announced a partnership with Trimble. So the two of you guys working together to build something pretty exciting. Can you share a little bit about what that partnership is and how you're trying to shape sort of the future of navigation?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that we're providing, I guess through our service, we've mentioned corrections a few times. And the interesting thing about a service that's even called corrections is inherently assuming that there's something that is incorrect to begin with. And as a commercial company, we don't make a whole lot of money selling something that is incorrect. And so we need to have our signals being monitored, and we feed that information back in so that our signals are correct from day one. And Trimble has some of the best experience in the world on developing those signal monitoring. They have the network around the world. So partnering with them has given us access that we need to ensure that our service is operating correctly with a high degree of accuracy and reliability. The other part is Trimble has one of the best correction services out there, and to be able to provide that data down. But one of the challenges with correction services today is back to the Skywatch mention of how do you make it standard, available, and affordable. And so for us and partnering with Trimble, that we basically will be broadcasting their correction services down as part of our service. So once you have the Pulsar service, you not only have access to the high accuracy coming from us, but you also get the data to be able to correct everything else out around you. And making that capability, again, just very standardized and highly accessible into the billions of GPS chips opens up a lot of opportunities to start to get higher levels of capability in devices and in units that previously would have maybe just not had it or been reliant on purely cellular. Or for example, cellular works in a lot of places, but it also doesn't work in a lot of places. And outside of that, historically, you've relied on things like geostationary communication satellites, which again work to an extent, but a lot of times they require dedicated hardware and can create some challenges, especially getting it into like commodity and lower level devices. So through that partnership, we're excited to open up the high accuracy world and getting this capability into more devices and more areas and just in more customers' hands, and excited to see what they can do with it. So
yeah, high accuracy, incredible reach.
Yep.
Great. So we're starting to get into a world where autonomy is becoming much more prevalent, both in the warfighting space, but also in the commercial side. So I'd love to get just broadly your guys' take on the role that the future of GPS and AltPNT will play in those sort of domains of autonomous navigation and autonomous battlefield.
I guess I can start. So we came from the autonomous world to start with, and that's in working in the autonomous vehicle world. And one of the things that we've realized there is that there's, I guess, starting with the automotive side, there's a really big difference in the level of accuracy and reliability and resilience that's needed between supporting, I guess, providing navigation to a human operator versus providing navigation to a machine operator. That humans are actually pretty smart, and there's a lot of things that they realize and could look. And like one of the driving use cases, for example, in the automotive world, is access lanes down the side of a freeway. And so the vehicle has to know, okay, it can say, even if you have perception, it knows that it's in a lane and it might be on the right side of the road, but it may not know, am I on the freeway and the speed limit's 75 miles an hour, or am I in the access lane and the speed limit's 25 miles an hour? Because when the next turn comes up, you really want to know what the next speed limit is, if you're on the right road or not. And so as you take the human operators increasingly out of the loop, whether it's for an on-road application or an off-road application or drones, the level of accuracy as well as the security and the resilience of what you're providing it, whatever that machine is, goes up and up and up by orders of magnitude to be able to replace just the logic and the capabilities of that human operator. And so, if you lose GPS, if you lose GPS in your car today, you're like, all right, well, I still generally know where I'm going. But when you start to take those things away from autonomous systems, their ability to coast on IMUs or to use other sorts of navigation can degrade pretty quickly a lot of the time. So it's really, AltPNT used to be this kind of military-only term. And what we found is that if you can actually provide the level of AltPNT and resilience and accuracy that you need to, automotive being one of the driving cases of trusting taking your hands off the wheel, you actually can, it umbrellas just about everything, even in the military world of how much even resistance to jamming that they need, that the jamming is no longer just a military problem either. So.
Yeah, I think just on the warfighting side, you look at the things that are happening in Ukraine, the lessons you can draw from that, and look at future conflicts, the ability to make decisions quickly and act on them. I think you're going to be driving things more autonomously than you have at this point. So I think we're learning a lot from what we're seeing right now, and developing going forward. Like, how do you get kind of inside that decision loop and leverage the autonomy for it?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen autonomy evolving in kind of some surprising ways. There's a project we've been working on in Japan with an automotive company, and basically their problem set was that vehicle-to-vehicle collisions have been going down in Japan as the ADAS systems and various guided protection, automatic braking, et cetera, get more and more implemented across the population. In the vehicles, the rate of fatalities and vehicular collisions were going down. But at the same time, the number of collisions between vehicles and people and bicycles and mopeds and tuk-tuks was continuing to go up. And so the bit that they've been looking at investing in is, can they get the accuracy of the mobile devices that people carry to be accurate enough that they can have basically the cars dodge the phones and the phones are attached to the people, which was fascinating that this concept of autonomy is increasingly branching out, not just vehicle to vehicle, but looking to encompass multiple modalities and interconnecting with folks at different levels, which was fascinating. It wasn't a use case we had ever thought of, so it's been really fascinating to look at more closely. But yeah, the automotive segment is particularly interesting, and these things kind of branch back into the defense side, and there's a wonderful back and forth of these technologies emerging out of defense and being adopted into the commercial sector, and techniques from the commercial sector being adopted back into the defense community. And I think probably nothing embodies that better than autonomy and positioning as that flow continues to kind of ping pong back and forth.
Okay.
I could add a fun quip to this that someone shared with us once. So, like, if you imagine if you were in a coma for 30 years and you woke up, what would be the first two questions that you ask? And it's, where am I and what time is it? And all these machines, so basically you want to know location and time. And that is, PNT, and what resilient PNT is providing is location and time. And all of these machines are effectively waking up every time they turn on, and they've got to figure out, where am I and what time is it? And so it is just PNT is this foundational layer that all of autonomy is generally built on. And so it's not only just getting them to initialize, but in general, the autonomy stack starts with, where am I, where's everything else going, and then how do you actually get there? So any error or just lack of that foundation for the pyramid, the whole rest of it kind of starts to fall apart.
So if these positioning systems are sort of the foundation of many new technologies that are coming online, so this is for everybody, what is sort of investor understanding and interest in GPS and AltPNT right now, based on conversations you guys are having? Tom, based on your conversations with other folks, is there a good understanding? Is there interest? Is there appetite for this opportunity?
So I guess what we've seen is less interest in a certain technology and more interest in a use case. And for our customers, our company, we're building satellites because we have to, more or less. That's what we're really building is, how do we solve customers' problems and how do they navigate? And the customers don't generally care if they're getting navigation from satellites or cell phone towers or birds singing songs out of the trees at them. If it gave them the navigation capability they wanted that was reliable and accurate enough, they would take it. And so that's where we see more of the investment interest in, defense has been a big interest lately, that there is just a big unmet need for navigational capabilities in the defense side. So it seems, in my mind, to be less technology related and more just, can you genuinely deliver the capability that different customers need to solve their problems?
Yeah, to pick up on that, defense investment in general has been booming the last couple of years. A lot of funds getting started, a lot of companies getting a lot of big rounds. So it's been a trend in the last couple of years, and I think, and that includes in PNT. I think you see some deals getting done that, maybe a couple of years ago were tougher to get done, and You've lived this to a certain extent. Like it's a little bit easier now to raise than it would have been a couple of years ago. So I think that'll continue to be the case where there's a lot of interest in the sector on the defense side.
Yeah, I think similarly, where we've really seen a shift as investors begin to realize how foundational PNT and positioning and localization is to the emergence of AI adoption. And as we get outside of thinking of LLMs as just next token predictors of words, but also having the ability to understand the real world space around us and how we interact with it, and that a critical part of understanding where you are, what you're looking at, and how you're interacting with the real world is positioning. And as those investors realize the ability to bridge that gap between the two, we definitely seen more interest begin to grow. Whereas before, people kind of saw it as, oh, this thing we take for granted, this thing we get for free, right? That's just there on our phones to go forward. And the blue dot gets close enough on my map that I can look up and see that, oh, there's the Starbucks, and I can figure out the last little bit. If it's 5 meters off or 10 meters off, it's not a big deal. But increasingly, as we do this shift into autonomy, we do this shift into AI, I think increasingly the investor markets are realizing how important this bridge between positioning and real-world enablement of AI and autonomy are to get the two things to come together.
I think that's a great way to end it. So, Sean, Tom, Brian, thank you so much for sharing your insights. This was incredibly helpful, and hopefully it tied a nice bow on the importance and value of GPS, both historically and where we're going. So, thank you.